La-di-la-di-la. Looks like we're safe. No enemies within long range of us. I smell cavalry. Yeah. La-di-la-di-la. Oh, how I love galloping in a field. Hi, welcome back to Painting with Bennett. This time I'm painting some more of my collection from the Song of Ice and Fire miniatures game, working on the relatively newly released giant spear throwers. I didn't specifically paint these to follow the format of an easily accessible tutorial, and I put a decent amount of work into them, so apologies in advance that this process might be a little hard to replicate depending on your available tools and your skill level. But with that out of the way, let's dive into it. Starting off with the airbrush, I based the model in a medium brown tone, leaving me room to easily go both darker and lighter in color from here. I typically rattle can prime my Free Folk minis with brown, but my brown spray can just ran out, so I primed them in gray and airbrushed on a layer of brown instead. Then I blocked in the skin with this dark, warm flesh color. I tried to avoid the cloth as much as I could. Spillover onto the hair is fine though, since I actually want the edges of the hair to sort of blend in with the skin anyway. When we eventually paint the hair, this should make it look like the hair is more realistically growing over the skin, as opposed to just a solid, perfectly opaque chunk of hair sitting on top of the skin. Also, make sure to get the toes. I think every single time I've painted a giant for this game, I've always forgotten to do the toes and had to go back for them. Now I pick a lighter skin color and start airbrushing that over the skin as a highlight. It's fine that the skin looks fairly pale right now. I'm mainly worried about establishing the gradient values. I'll add in a lot more color and vibrancy to it when I switch to the brushwork, so I'm fine with the skin looking a bit pale and gaunt. Then I airbrush dark umber onto the bases, as well as using it to shade the clothes and such. Mostly I'm just spraying this onto the insides of the legs, the bottom of the tabard thing, and under the armpits. And I had a sort of pale khaki color in my airbrush from working on a completely different mini, so I used that to highlight the leathers as well quick. It doesn't really matter at all what exact colors you use for these things. I think it was P3 Moldy Ochre, but it really doesn't matter. It could just be some off-white or ivory mixed into your brown paint. At this point, you can see that suddenly the bases have some blue and gray on them. I just threw that on before playing a few games at a local tournament, just so that the bases sort of match the rest of my partly unfinished Free Folk army. I've now switched to my brush, and I took a good bit of contrast medium and added a little bit of Wildwood contrast paint to it. Wildwood is a super strong paint, so I didn't add too much of it. And I applied this all over the browns, only avoiding the areas of fur. On some large areas like the thighs, while the paint was wet, I used a wet brush to pull it away from the top of the surface a bit, with the paint still left there being naturally thinned by the water. Next, I do some dry brushing in a couple of steps, starting with a lightish brown color and then mixing my way up to almost pure off-white. I used a large makeup brush, and I dry brushed pretty much everything on the mini that wasn't skin, hair, or the rocks. Because the model is so big, and there are all sorts of densely textured cloth and bone surfaces, I think dry brushing is absolutely the way to go for these parts of the mini. I take this dry brushing very light, all the way to the pure off-white. At first I thought I'd do this and just darken the surfaces down a bit at a later stage, but I ended up just leaving them like this. It does look very bright right now, but once all the other colors are highlighted up, it fits in much better. Next I do a rough wet blend of lighter and darker colors on the tabards, as well as the spear cloth wraps, just for a bit of extra color. I'm introducing some color here, because I don't want my army to just look like various shades of brown. I think that's a little bit too drab. Just because they're free folk doesn't mean they can't have colors and dyes and all sorts of stuff in their clothing. For one, I went with a purple. I used this Pro Acryl Dark Purple and Viejo Model Color Blue Violet. And for one I chose green, using Pro Acryl Black Green and P3 Mage Hunter Green. I do also think that a red cloth color would look really nice as an accent, but I'm kind of saving that for Mag the Mighty, since he's the big important chieftain and I want to reserve the most bold and striking bright red color for him. Now, wet blending works great on large, fairly flat surfaces like the ones on these giants. I also don't mind thinning my paints down slightly, since then those dry brushed highlights will show through a little bit. Just keep in mind that thinning your paints down with water will make them more runny, and during the wet blending the paints will be more eager to spread, so to speak, and also might dry a bit faster. Next, I used the old reliable Vallejo model color Pale Gray Blue to base coat all the fur trim around the boots, cloths, and etc. I thinned it and applied 2 coats for a nice solid base coat. As you've probably picked up on, I really love this Pale Gray Blue paint color. I use it in probably almost every paint job. It's a really nice cold gray that is awesome as a highlight for pretty much any part of a paint job that will end up with a cool or cold color, and it looks desaturated enough that it fits in with a more realistic scheme. Now before I move on to finishing the fur trim or painting the hair or anything, first I switch over to quickly highlighting the bones. I want to get a sense of how all the different brown and tan and ivory colors sort of look together on the model, and see where that leaves me when I'm selecting new colors to incorporate into the painting process. So I paint several scratchy highlights on the bones, starting with this khaki color and highlighting up through off-white. I keep these highlights very rough and scratchy to simulate the look of old, weathered, and worn down bones, and also to make the painting fast and easy. My first layer covers most of the bone surface, but leaves the brown in the recesses, and then I just do a couple of highlights from there. Then I move on to doing a quick highlight on all the ropes, keeping it out of the recesses where possible. I achieve this effect doing the sort of half dry brushing effect that I've shown in previous videos, wicking off a lot of paint from my brush, but not quite to the level of dry brushing. In some spots though, I did have to keep the paint a bit thicker for better opacity, and in some spots like in the stitching over the colored cloth, I did need to mix in some dark umber to boost the shadows and opacity. And since it's on the palette, might as well do a quick highlight by mixing in some off-white. Of course, you might prefer how the stitches and ropes looked before, more of a neutral color that blends into the rest of the cloth. I like adding lots of color to my Free Folk army where I can though, but that's just personal preference. That feels like the clothing section of these minis are in a pretty good spot right now, so it's back to that fur trim. I use one of my favorite speed paints, Runic Grey, and apply that all over the fur. Once that's dry, it looks nicely shaded, so I take my pale gray blue color again, get it on a brush completely unthinned, and wipe most of it off on a paper towel. Doing my same sort of half dry brushing technique as before, I swipe the side of the brush over most of the raised fur texture. I do this a couple of times, mixing in a little bit of white as well to really build up this highlight color, specifically focusing it on the areas I think won't be as hidden in shadow. Generally all of the upturned areas are on the spots, not near the underside of the arms or legs. I did eventually switch to doing some actual dry brushing for this as well. As a general note on color choices and my process, my advice, especially with painting free folk, is to not sweat the small stuff. And what I mean by that is that for all of these different colors I'm picking for the elements, like the bones, the fur, the ropes, the waistcloths, it doesn't really matter at all. I don't stress myself out or take up too much brain power deliberating over exactly which hue of tan will perfectly harmonize my scheme, because honestly, I don't really think it matters. Now, to be fair, I do think it would look a little off if I took like a saturated blue, stuck it next to a lime yellow, and then added some pink or some orange or anything wild like that. But I just try to keep my colors somewhat muted and not overly contrasted. But more or less, whatever colors you pick, once you highlight them with some unifying colors like ivories and off-whites, or even highlight them with a light gray or an ice yellow or anything like that, then it starts to fit together nicely. If things still look a little bit weird, try glazing a unifying shadow tone onto the surfaces, or using a similar wash color over all of them. If 2 or 3 or 4 different colors all have shadows that are tinted one color, then suddenly all of those colors will look much less out of place next to each other. A great, commonly used example of this is when you shade an entire mini with Agrex Earthshade or Nuln Oil or something, but you could also do something like adding a purple glaze to all of your shadow areas. Now, while I've been doing all that rambling, you can see that I've started painting some quick highlights on all of the green and purple cloth. And just because I love painting that way and because they're free folk, I made all of these highlights very scratchy and textured. I highlighted the wood with several layers, starting with a mix of bright ivory and burnt sienna, but that felt a little bit too red, so I swapped the burnt sienna out for a mahogany color, and that felt like it worked a lot better. Onto the hair. On the female giant, I did a wet blend to give her a sort of light to dark gray gradient effect, painting the light gray roughly around the top half of her hair, and the dark gray around the bottom half. I had to thin the paint down a decent amount to get it to flow between all of these clumps and strands of hair texture, and when I did that, the sort of light gray ran into the recesses a little bit too much. I can fix that later, but if I was doing this over again, I would probably use a wet blend of speed paints instead of regular acrylic paints. I did the same thing but with a little bit more success on the male giant, doing a wet blend to establish a nice bright orange color for his hair. Then at this point, before refining any of the hair or the skin, I decided to paint the eyes, painting them the same way as I always do. I start by painting white, and painting it over more of the eye than is necessary. Then I paint a vertical dark blue or black line, starting with a nice thin line, and stopping when I get it to a decent width. Then I just use my shadow flesh color to clean up the border around the eyes, and there we go. And at this point, because I had my airbrush out to varnish some other minis, I quickly blasted these with a thin layer of matte varnish, just to lock things in and prevent myself from rubbing off any paint as I continue to handle the models with my oily fingers. I didn't capture any footage of this, I just figured I'd mention it so that you know exactly what I'm doing. Anyway, next I dry brush some highlights on the hair, just slowly working it up in several layers. Where needed, I also did a little bit of refining on the hair, putting some thin paint in the recesses or boosting the highlights a little further. Mainly I did this on the gray hair, darkening it down quite a bit to give it some definition against the fur trim, which looked like a pretty similar color. In general, I think the orange hair turned out a lot better and was a lot easier than the gray hair, although that's mostly because I chose to make the fur gray as well. Onto the skin. It already looks pretty bright and doesn't look bad at all from the airbrushing, but the shadows still look a little gray and desaturated. The skin is the last big thing to do, so I just decided to bite the bullet and work on that next. I start by thinning down my darker skin color with glaze medium, and glazing that into all of the shadows. As I usually do when I work with large surfaces, I keep a damp brush handy so that if I misplace any paint, or if I think the paint will dry with too noticeable of a line, I can feather that out nicely. I also keep repeating this in several stages, starting to mix in a nice purple shadow color. After repeating that a few times, I switched to painting some highlights instead, first just using the lighter skin color thinned down to a pretty good amount. I am painting my skin highlights with a good bit of texture, because I feel like a giant's skin would definitely be aged, worn, and leathery with plenty of wrinkles. Looking at this comparison shot, I hope you can tell which models had the skin work done and which one hasn't, because I think it makes a huge difference. Then I just keep on going, doing even deeper shading and even brighter highlighting, just keeping my colors nice and thin the whole while. I worked down to a pure purple shadow color in several layers, but since the layers are thin, they never really change the shadow color to completely match this dark purple color. Now I've got the skin to a good spot that I'm very satisfied with. Not necessarily award-winning, but also a pretty good gradient with textured highlights and rich, deep shadows. And just look at what a difference that makes. Also, when I started painting the skin on the female giant, I noticed this pretty nasty mold line on the arm that I forgot to remove, so I actually just went back and cut this off, and then just repainted over that area with a rough skin gradient. I think it was totally worth the effort to do this, and it honestly really wasn't that hard at all to just paint over the bare plastic and cover it up. Just a few more things to finish before wrapping this project up. I mixed a dark bluish gray color and roughly wet blended that into the shadows of the stone, using a lighter gray color as the highlight. When that was dry, I gave it a strong dry brush to really emphasize that weathered, stony look. Now this sort of metal belt buckle shield thing on the male giant has a beautiful brown gradient, but I decided to cover it up, painting it as a brassy metal color. I actually did a wet blend of two colors here, using a light silvery brass color on the top half and a darker tin color on the bottom half. Then I weathered the heck out of it, doing some layers of Nailac Oxide Technical paint, some stippled silver highlights, and some thinned dots and streaks of darker blue and green. That's looking good, so the only thing left is the bases. I very heavily stipple light gray all over them, and then it's time for the snow effect. I made a thick slurry of Army Painter snow beads, Mod Podge, and water, and I used my crappiest brushes to slop this all over the bases. I've settled on this as my favorite method of applying snow effects. It's not too expensive to make, and I can't even imagine how many of those pricey Citadel snow texture pots you'd need to buy if you wanted to base your whole army with them. I've also tried the method of painting on PVA glue and sprinkling the snow beads on top of that, but never again. The beads get absolutely everywhere, and the one tray of Raiders I did this on still sheds beads every single time I pick it up. I also wipe a lot of the snow paste over the feet of my giants and the bottom of their robes. As with everything I do, it's totally optional, but I think it's a fun bit of storytelling. Of course, since these giants are stomping through snow, they'll get tons of snow all over their feet. Once the snow dries, the Mod Podge dries clear, and the amount of snow on the base feels like it shrinks a little bit. If it's not enough, I just go back and do it a second time, trying not to go too overboard. Then one last optional fun little effect. I take some Blood for the Blood God technical paint, and I propped my mini up at a good angle and then flicked the paint onto the base. I also did this on his shield, as well as on the other giant's spear tip. This is just another easy chance to add some color to these minis and their bases. Now these two giants are done and ready to destroy some cavalry from across the map. Since all of the free folk giants cost so many points to take in-game, you only need a handful of them for a full list, and that means it's easy for me to justify spending a good chunk of time painting each of them. I love how they turned out, and as always, I'm happy to answer any questions you have for me. And as always, I don't really care about monetization or video metrics, but if you like, subscribe, or leave a nice comment, it does bring me a lot of happiness. Thanks for watching, take care of yourself, and as a parting thought, try to find something right now to give yourself a compliment for. Whoever's watching this, I probably don't know you in person, but I do know that you deserve it. See you next time.